And a very warm welcome. You're joining us once again at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24. Tonight we will be focusing on security challenges, international relations, foreign policy, as well as geopolitics concerning Sri Lanka. I've invited to our studios an expert in international relations, international security and security studies. Let me warmly welcome the Director for the Centre for Strategic Assessment and Senior Lecturer for Strategic Studies at General Sir John Kothalavala Defence University, Dr. Harinda Vidanage. A very warm welcome to you.
Good evening, Indeewari. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much for taking the time to be here at Hyde Park. When you say you are a strategist and an academic on security studies from a strategic perspective, what does this mean?
This means there are two subdisciplines of international relations. One is called international security studies, which basically looks at how, especially in the post-Second World War environment, how the world power architecture works and what kind of security guarantees, what kind of security processes, what kind of security institutions are needed, and academics who study that, especially after the Second World War, are fall into the branch of security studies academics. And strategic studies is another subdiscipline which emerged especially after the Second World War with the nuclear factor. When countries, what people don't realize is after the Second World War, the security landscape of the world changed because certain countries acquired weapons that can cause what we call mass destruction or mass casualties. So that created the need for a systematic understanding of strategy from a military perspective, but which also has a bearing on civilian life, because the Second World War had the largest impact on civilians than any other war in human history, because the victims were mostly civilians. So that is why civilians started studying strategy, especially from a perspective of nuclear thinkers, nuclear security, nuclear strategy, and then strategy became part of what we call now modern day statecraft. So if you are a president, if you are a foreign minister, if you are a leader in armed forces, if you are a leading academic, you need to provide that chain of information. How do you strategically understand and establish power relations and also achieve national interests? So to achieve national interests of any nation, big or small, you need to have strategic thought and strategic approaches. That is why countries have national security strategies, national defense strategies. So that is the term strategy entered the lexicon of modern day usage through strategic studies. Even the terms we used in business studies, management, which we now call, we have things called a marketing strategy. But that term is borrowed from old school strategic studies.
How much of contribution do we see in other countries, especially in countries where security, national security is taken very seriously from a strategic perspective? Do academics, experts as you, contribute to the thought process and the strategy making process?
There is this process called academics and researchers in circulation. So most leading universities in the world will have academics who will go and work as policy advisors, or it can be intelligence, it can be foreign service, it can be defense ministries, it can be a think tank. For example, India has revamped its national security secretariat. Thousands of academics are consulted by Indian security establishment for various things. So academia, especially in the realm of strategic processes or realm, they always interchange. Unfortunately, we don't have that culture where academics kind of do that secondment. So I always take an example. A couple of years back, we had a delegation of Chinese academics from leading Chinese university who wanted to meet Sri Lankan strategists, strategic studies people, and to the embarrassment of most of my colleagues, all of those they were all university professors or lecturers. They all have done at least 2 terms in missions in South Asia. So they were either second secretary, first secretary, political counselor in Dhaka, in Delhi, in Kathmandu. So see,
so academics also had
they come with that experience. So and that is shared. So the academic expertise is given, the input is given to the system as well as they draw. So the best academic is a learning academic. not a knowing academic. So our job is not, we people, when we are academics in Sri Lanka, mostly we think we know. The strength of an academic is always the learning academic.
Are you saying that Sri Lanka does not have that kind of contribution from academics, nor do academics at strategic decision-making level have experience or expertise working in missions
yeah, I think
experience?
so. I think very few of us kind of cross this threshold, cross this. Sometimes it can, in Sri Lanka, I think can be like a crossing of the Rubicon. It's something you don't do, but I think it's what you must do. I think it's a cultural thing, it's an institutional thing, and other thing is we have a bit of a vacuum in our think tank space as well, where academics mostly globally contribute to think tanks. The think tanks are consulted by states, state entities, non-state entities. Now you have what we call business political intelligence. Recently we call it, so there is this article recently that came up saying geopolitics of the C-suite. So because the global volatility is creating, even for the corporate sector to drive business intelligence units, that is, the input is given by think tanks or academics. So they want to know what's going to happen with the Red Sea, what's going to happen with the Indo-Pacific rivalry or competition between the US and China, maybe India. So, and how is it going to impact their business? So I think the problem is we need to create a mechanism where this academic circulation of policy, corporate and civil society has to work. Then only we get these academics who are policy driven, or what we call who has the ability to do applied research and applied kind of contribution. We have what we call academic research in most of our academic institutions. That is academic research. That is good for academic advancement. So most of academics and academic, even young people who pursue academic research. Their dissertations, their thesis, research is driven through academic inquiry. But there is something called what we call policy research, or in modern terms we call it applied research.
Right.
So for research on intelligence, research on military modernization, research on efficiency or management of systems, cyber security. These are all areas of applied research.
Right. I'd like to speak further on how much this kind of research will contribute to Sri Lanka going forward. But before that, let's understand from your expertise, through your kind of research, what external threats or security challenges do we really see as a small nation, Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Indeewari, because in Sri Lanka we have a bit of a crisis of narratives, because we take things either, as you said, threats, but I think the security, from our perspective, the security environment is very complex and complicated. So the complexity and the complication adds to a small island nation's reading of its security environment, but it is a necessity. One of the challenges we have faced consistently still since the end of 2009 internal conflict, is that we have not been able to calibrate our national security requirements and how that goes into our foreign policy making, how it goes to our economic prosperity plans, and how it goes to our modernization or defense restructuring, and to do all that, Sri Lanka has to do an assessment of the external environment. So from my basic analysis, so there has to be what we call a regional analysis. That is, how does our region how is it changing, right? Basically, how are our neighbors changing? How is our neighborhood changing? Which means the ocean spaces, the terrestrial as well as the outer space, and then the region at large, that is beyond the understood region of South Asia into Indian Ocean region, and then the globe. For example, there are global trepidations, no? So there are, in the last 5 years, we faced a pandemic, we faced changing political landscapes. There are huge change in how big powers, for example, take the United States. We are in between 2 Trump presidencies, and then we have a changing China. A China that is very different from a China that was about 10-15 years ago. India, a decade ago, if you look at India a decade ago and India now, it's so different. So if you are going to make policy in Sri Lanka related to security, related to economy, related to connectivity, one of the first things you need to do is understand how India has changed. That's a regional assessment, right? When I say change, not just structurally or ideologically, but in its pursuit of objectives. We need to know, where does India want to be? Where is India heading? So,
do you think Sri Lanka is today sensitive to
I think we are more sensitive. I think we are a little bit more sensitive and pragmatic about India more. And now, I mean, I think we see a lot of India-Sri Lanka dialogue, and there is this state level interaction. But I think the nuances, the deeper research, the deeper analysis of India's pursuit, India's aspirations from an economic perspective, India's aspirations from a political, military perspective, security perspective, as well as what we can gain from it. I think one of the biggest problems in the country is because we lack the strategic thought or the assessment, we then become victims of narratives as well as conspiracies. So that is, from an academic perspective, self-harming. Very much.
What is the relationship here between strategic security thinking and nationalistic views? You spoke about campaigns, narrow-minded narratives, especially when Sri Lanka's geographical proximity poses the nation to face several threats, whether it's pressures from a surveillance perspective, or whether it's security concerns from our closest neighbor, India. And we're also talking about China. You mentioned China. Do you think we're sensitive to this? Do you think we've understood this from a strategic perspective?
I think since we lack a framed strategic thinking, so what we then have is strategic worldviews of the leadership of a country. That is normal, right? So the challenge for a strategist or for people who draft or help strategically guide leadership is that they can't be political. They can't be thinking as I can't which I mean I can't be giving strategic advice or strategic analysis to become a popular person or a person who's appeasing. The strategist has to speak the bare truth and to give the fair assessment of based on what we call the national interests. National interests of any nation, there are certain fundamentals. Unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, since we don't have a vital national security strategy or a national security policy in writing or a little bit in frame, of course, attempts have been made and attempts will be made. And I think it's very necessary for us, given the regional and the global volatility that we live in, we need to draft and adopt at least across the board, where political consensus is reached, some pillars of national security. Otherwise, we are not going to get this done. We will be in more trouble. So we need to kind of draft that to address some of these issues that we can discuss.
So Sri Lanka has faced several challenges, whether it's threats or security challenges, as you've in a broader context outlined. We had a 3-decade war, internal insurgencies, riots, external challenges, the most recent also the extremist attacks in the form of Easter Sunday, terror attacks. And with all that, how would you assess the importance you mentioned of national security strategy, as well as how do you compare this to other nations? Give us some examples of some success stories from our closest neighbor as well as some of the most developed countries.
So this national security, because we keep on talking about it, national security as an institution and a framing came in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the Americans introduced the NSC, National Security Policy framework, where they established national security as an institution through various arms of the government, and kind of brought national security into a policy discourse and a policy framework, right? So fast forward that to the 21st century, what has happened is what countries have realized is, especially in the second decade of the 20th century, we have started realizing our international security landscape has been changing. So I start from where you said about Sri Lanka's 3-decade conflict. So when the 3-decade conflict was going on, mostly the global environment was a bit more stable than it is now. So what Sri Lanka kind of, what we encountered at the end of the conflict was a rapidly changing landscape. right, about 10-15 years back. And I think one of the drawbacks we had was we were not able to grasp those sudden changes because we were so focused on a three-decade conflict, how to end it. And from a strategic military perspective, we were successful in defeating a terror outfit and as well as dismantling that particular. But then what happened was it came at the cost of not being able to focus our resources and strategic thought into understanding this rapidly changing global landscape as well as the regional landscape. So one example is how India has changed, how the changing of India and the changes around the Indian Ocean as well as the emerging rivalry between the United States and China, and then how it translates into regional challenges. How does India and China relate to, and how as a country, as a small power, how do we navigate that? And now fast forward that even in the last 5 years, we come to a pandemic, we come to one political upheaval, and then we come to a political transition and economic crisis. So now there is the new administration that is in power has to, I said I don't want to be political, I don't have to be political. As a strategist, what I want to say is new administration now has to kind of take stock of what has happened in the last 5 years and has to look up forward what's going to happen in the next decade and look at look at our region and look at the bilateral relations and now recalibrate. So I think we have reached a point where it's absolute necessary. Sri Lanka now has to draft and formulate and adopt a national security strategy to move forward, because we may think economic crisis by just adopting certain things like this IMF. Yes, these are all, we are in a rescue and resuscitation path. But path to progress has to be within a larger strategic framework. How do we manage our economic affairs? Parallel to that, how do we manage our foreign affairs? Parallel to that, how do we restructure and optimize our national security or defense through defense? So these are the three primary planks of any country's path to stability. So economic, so then diplomacy and foreign policy and defense.
So you're highlighting that economic security is mandatory, is key here, especially when we talk about stability, and defense plays a key role here.
Yeah. So you asked about examples. I always, one of my recent experiences and recent interactions were very closely with the Japanese. So while I was in Tokyo a few months back, I had the kind of I had a lot of briefings from both the Japanese Foreign Ministry as well as Defense Ministry, and especially the way the Japan had done their national security strategy. If you look back, most of the countries that we know, even the advanced countries, started formulating national security strategies about 10 to 12 years back. The Japanese did it for the first one was 2013. For the United States, the current iteration of national security strategies, they started in 2007, 2008 during Obama period.
Right. So is this in the face of evolving?
It's in the face of evolving. If not, they had something different, but that came from the defense. For example, the US had what they call the quadrennial defense review, not a national security one. But then the executive, presidency took over, the president, White House took over formulating a larger one. So it's not like 40-50 years back. So that is because of the changing landscape. So Japan is in its the recent iteration is 2022. A very interesting way of how Japan has identified what it's. So they say the national security strategy is the supreme policy document of the government, of the state, not just the government, of the state, irrespective of what political party is going to be in power, that is guiding its achievement of its national security objectives by safeguarding and realizing its national interests. So what are Japan's national interests? Same as any country: integrity and territorial sovereignty, economic prosperity, citizen centrism, right? And good relations, and of course with their allies, but they also have a different set of strategic challenges which are not common to us. So you can see that whole as the thing, and it clearly says national security now is very different to national security as before. It encompasses things like economic security, climate, development, social cohesion, So this is, I mean, I take Japan as an example because Japan's, if you look at the Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans, the so-called Indo-Pacific region, we sit on two different locations, but we are both island nations. So it's very, and we have very interesting relations. Japan and Sri Lanka, we are both Asian societies and Asiatic. So we can see how even Asian nations think. Of course, Japan may be more Western than Sri Lanka, Western in the sense geopolitically West, but this example, I think we should draw lessons and then go to Australia. Australia has also started doing periodic defense reviews and national security reviews, and they identify certain common challenges we face, and they also identify certain threats. Some of their threats are not our threats because they have different political ambitions and things, and they are part of different alliances. But I think Sri Lanka has, as a pragmatic, we have stood fast on either on non-alignment or neutrality. But I think, of course, there's a debate about how non-aligned we should be in Sri Lanka. That's a different debate. But
so these defense strategies are published. Australia, you mentioned. Japan, you mentioned. Are they transparent?
The thing is this: in countries, when you formulate national security strategies and defense strategies, certain country, most of it is not, is 100% is not been published. There is a certain percentage of the document and certain fundamentals that are in the public realm. Then actually, that is one of the most important things. That is something we are missing. The value of a national security strategy document is that when you have that, it is the base document where even starting from the legislature, say in Sri Lanka's parliament, have you heard about national security debates, foreign policy debates, whose son went to there, whose daughter went there? I'm not blaming anyone, but our debates are very trivial, very tribal, very low level, not strategic. That is because we don't have a guiding principle of, so if somebody comes with the document and says, look, the debate is about this, how do, through this foreign policy perspective, we achieve our national security goals. So instead of who's who in a mission, who is looking after trade? Do we have enough diplomats trained to promote Sri Lankan trade? Do we have enough diplomats in countries that Sri Lanka does trading mostly? For example, with our FTAs, with our bilateral trade, do we have enough people promoting? Diplomats, in embassies, it's your part of the job is to promote your national interest, which is economic. So how many do we have in the context of trade? How many do we have even in the context of Sri Lanka? So that is the way we think strategically about relations when we kind of draft a national security policy.
If we look to India, how has the strategic thinking helped their national security strategy?
India's national security thinking is something that we should study. It's because in the last 10 years, especially since the Modi administration, I think they have significantly systemized the way national security thinking, institutions and defense establishment functions. So they have one of the most expansive national security secretariats under a national security advisor, NSA. Even the sensitive investment that comes to India first goes through the national security secretariat. So say for example, a Chinese company wants to invest in India. Right, say in a crucial, say app, it's a simple app maybe, but it's a good for India, it's a good for China. They say, okay, it's good, it's okay, but the proposal has to go to that. And if then secretariat vets it, and if the secretariats need more background research, they get a think tank that is affiliated and with experts, say in certain, say about this particular technology. Will this have backdoors? Will this have certain vulnerabilities? They do the research for them, and then they say to tell the cabinet, we are okay with this. So that's the level of strategic thinking that India has evolved into. So I think, Sri Lanka, because we are now in economic crisis, we are desperate for certain investments, but we also have to be mindful of our national interests and national security. So that is why this kind of thinking is very important.
Before we go in for a short break again, Sri Lanka's modern day threats, what we as a small island nation face, and how our national security strategy should be focused to face these threats, counter these threats, and also prepare for economic stability?
Yeah, I think that is where we have to, as I said earlier, we have to have a consensus and have a national security strategy been released and worked on. There were a few that was done before, and I think there is certain reviews been done on the preliminary, the previous ones. So Sri Lanka needs. Coming from our expertise, we also need a defense strategy, because being island nation, some of the challenges, because we are island nation, some of the challenges mostly come from, there will be maritime. But are we maritime? Are we prepared? Are maritime institutions prepared? There is a lot of, because Sri Lanka, for example, take a service. We have a navy. Navy is going through a huge transition, which is great. Navy is being, I think Navy has done some of the best diplomacy. Navy and Air Force both has done real great military diplomacy. They have managed to secure a lot of what we call platforms, assets that help us do surveillance on the ocean, prevent piracy. Then Air Force has got a lot of assets what we call through modernization. But I think, and they have their own doctrines coming out. But I think we are seriously still in need of a serious defense revamp based on what we call the principle of force optimization and modernization. Force optimization means we need, the government is, we have to bring our wartime numbers down, headcount wise.
But how does this really work? We are talking about security, gearing up to face emerging challenges, but government is, as you mentioned, optimizing, but this also means downsizing. And here we are talking about strengthening defense-related allocations and investments into research. But how does this?
That's why I think that
other countries also improving their spending.
Yeah, other countries are also improving spending, but the spending is not. See, Sri Lanka's problem is our spending is a recurrent cost. That means we are paying salaries. Take the Sri Lankan army. I think 90%, nearly 95% goes for salaries. So that is the whole point here. So if you are paying, if you are doing recurrent costs annually, there is no money to do modernization. There is no money to do research. So that is why I think the whole logic is we had an artificially inflated number during. Of course, there was a reason for that. Now we have to bring the numbers down. So force optimization and modernization literally means, if when the heads count comes down, how do you offset that to improve your preparedness and your readiness? These are the two, how prepared as a defense services we are, and how ready we are. That readiness and preparedness is based on our capabilities and capacity. So that means we have to use resources, technology, know-how to increase our capability and capacity, right? So that is what you mean by force optimization. So that is what basically is modernization is about. So instead, if in layman's terms, let's say we have a tank that needs 7 crew, we might need new platforms. We might not even need tanks. Sri Lanka may not need tanks, because the tanks are being phased out anyway. We might need other platforms. We might need troop deployment capabilities. We might need more surveillance capabilities. We might need more hydrographic capabilities. So things like that, hydrographic research capabilities. So bringing numbers down does not mean we are compromising our security, but that has to be done systematically in a way where there is a modernization process in place which comes through defense. When it comes to defense policies, new defense policies, how do you call it? Maintaining a defense architecture, posture, and procurement, and then how do you develop capacities of countries. So the argument is, if you bring the numbers down, recurrent costs can come down, and that money might be able to be put into R&D and modernization.
How do you assess Sri Lanka's preparedness, readiness? You mentioned.
I think, to be very fair to the armed forces, even with what we call the legacy platforms, that is, these are like, some of our platforms are quite old, but our military professionalism has still been maintained. Of course, we have challenges of recruitment, retention. These are challenges given the economic crisis, and this, in globally every military is facing retention and recruitment challenges. Take the Royal Navy. Royal Navy is less in numbers than Sri Lankan Navy, and they have huge problems in maintaining their assets. So I think we are at a professional level, we are still at good optimum levels, but I think it goes back to the first question you asked me, evolving challenges externally. How prepared are we? We may be prepared. How capable are we? That's the problem.
On that note, I think it's time we take a short break here at Hyde Park. We are in conversation with Dr. Harinda Vidanage, expert in international security and strategic studies. We'll be back after this short break with yet another discussion on the same topic. Welcome back. We are in conversation with Dr. Harinda Vidanage, Director for the Center for Strategic Assessment. Dr. Harinda Vidanage, I think we've been talking about India, China, Japan as well. I think their exemplary defense and strategic framework. But you mentioned that Sri Lanka is prepared, is ready, but the threats are evolving. How do you assess, especially when we talk about the Sri Lanka's crisis, our economic stability, and the relation between these evolving threats and risk to the economy? How do you assess that?
Well, the thing is, when we look at risks and threats, we look at it from a time-bound thing. So, what are the immediate ones? What are the medium term and to the long term? So, and then we also look at what are the most there may be threats that are very challenging, say nuclear, say breakdown of the economic, economic stability. But what we in strategic calculations, we look at what is the most probable ones and what are the ones that we really need to address quickly. So the ones we have to address quickly are evolving as a result of the changing geopolitical landscape. So one of the biggest challenges can be that there is a significant global uncertainty and volatility, and there are conflicts brewing around us. Some are quite far from us, but then it starts reverberating in our neighborhoods and having an impact on our lives. So, for example, when I take a simple example, when the conflict in Gaza started, you had a Red Sea crisis, and then some in Sri Lanka were asking, so what? Then the problem is, of course, that the sea lanes are affected, transiting of merchant naval assets are affected. Then you need a certain unified effort to provide the security, because that will have a bearing on all of us. Because people didn't realize even our trade, our whatever we exported, that they had to use certain routes, and that if we did not contribute to that collectively, we will face price hikes, challenges, shortages, all these things. That's one side. The other side is, of course, we have to understand there is an increasing rivalry, especially between United States and China. And you can clearly see, if you look at the current Trump administration, the Trump administration's key geopolitical challenge is China. There is no doubt about it. So if you are a strategist reading the United States strategic interest and ambitions, you really need to understand United States will be very hard on China, and also will be hard on anything to do with China, any relationship, any country, anything. So that doesn't mean we are going to it's going to affect our relations with China, but we have to be very mindful of that fact. Then the other thing is, when volatility rises, one of the bulwarks against volatility is regionalism and regional institutions. Now, for example, when US is kind of changing its stance in Europe, the Europeans are trying to get together and trying to work as more of a robust EU bloc. Of course, they have their own set of problems. Then if you look at Southeast Asia, those countries have ASEAN. You look at our part of the world, we don't have any regional architecture that Sri Lanka can fall back upon. So these are one of the arguments I have been strongly making. We had SAARC, but technically SAARC is what we call is brain dead. It's kind of, it's non-functional. Then we have other frameworks like BIMSTEC and IORA. They are still not mature, or the maturity level has not reached like ASEAN. So one of the strengths of ASEAN, if you look at, is they have their security dialogues, they have their security protocols, they have their way of, their integration is so robust. So for smaller states like Sri Lanka, when you are weathering a geopolitical storm and seeing another one just coming that is bigger than what we weathered, and when we realize we don't have a fallback option in the context of a regional institutional architecture, our next best option is the relationship with the most powerful country or entity in the region. So that is why I always stress the importance of India-Sri Lanka relations. India remains one of these unique countries which has benefited from somewhat of the chaos, but has managed the chaos and is emerging as probably the world's fastest growing economy and the 5th largest economy. Probably it's projected in about by 2035, it will be the 3rd largest economy on earth. So then, are we going to be still trapped in an ideology and a mindset of looking at India the way we tried to look at it 20 years ago and have all the reservations we had? Or are we going to make sure our relations are that robust and that stable and that sincere, that we manage to navigate this storm with a certain alignment with India? This doesn't mean being, don't get me wrong, this is not about trying to be a pro-India. No, this is a strategic understanding of India.
Are you saying in the face of volatility, US volatility, you look to that
global
country,
volatility,
and also the US administration, you have Donald Trump now, and then policies change. We're talking about a trade war. We're talking about other emerging changes as the US administration introduces new policies. And then there's China. With all this, are you saying Sri Lanka, as a fallback plan, look to India? And
I think the India. So in such an environment, the India-Sri Lanka relations is crucial, critical for Sri Lanka. And that is what I'm going to say, because what do you understand in this about this Trump administration also, we always talk about Trump. It's not just a Trump, it's a change in America's global outlook. The US is, we are trying to say there is mercantilism. No, it's not. US has acquired a new degree of sense of nationalism that is channeled through the Trump administration, and they have a particular view about how they do interact with the world. So it of course partly transactionalist, but it is more driven by a sense of new American nationalism that is framed in a certain way. So that also hardens their stances on certain issues, certain countries, certain things, certain value chains, value sets. So that we have to understand. That doesn't mean we are going to totally go with it, but strategic sensitive, you have to be strategically sensitive about these things. Strategic sensitivity is a very key thing, and in that context, India-Sri Lanka relations is pretty crucial.
We were talking about defense budgets earlier. 442 billion in 2025 allocated via the budget, higher than the 2024 allocation. This is also behind on the grounds that Sri Lanka lacks military technology currently to face counter modern threats.
I think it's what we call modernization. Our challenge is very much of modernization.
And there has been much conversation around the industry of weaponry and manufacturing of weapons in Sri Lanka. How do you look at this?
So this is another area where people get very upset and very, when you say, okay, weapons, are we, what about weapons manufacturing? Why are you even talking about it? So this is, I think it's just term, weapon, we have very negative connotations about arms, ammunition. But from a strategic perspective, again, coming from, from an economic perspective, we call this a country's defense industrial base. A country's defense and defense resilience is also measured by the defense industry that it possesses. So that is so that is why one of the reasons why Europeans are terrified, or Europe is very worried with the Americans pulling out or ceasing the support it provided to Ukraine in its conflict with Russia, because though the Europeans have there were 20 odd countries, they have various armaments, none of them has a robust defense industrial base. What does it mean? It means the ability to manufacture, maintain manufacturing, maintaining output, supplies, especially during wartime, to provide the numbers that is necessary, right? And then they realized Russia, though they were criticizing Russia, had a better industrial base, and also Russia had a better strategic approach. When the Russians were running out of ammunition, especially artillery and all, they reached out to the North Koreans, because the Russia's military assets are Russia is one of the largest global vendors of the value market of weapons. That is the more affordable weapons. So most countries bought Russian platforms. So for example, till very recently, 70% of India's defense platform were Russian in origin and Russian architecture. So Russians could be able to buy back from North Korea what they wanted, right? And even the Americans realized their defense industrial architecture base was not good. But one country which thrived recently is India again. Why? When Prime Minister Modi came to power, he brought this Made in India policy, where he said at least 10% of his defense manufacturing should take place in India. I don't know, a lot of people don't know. Today, most of the European war is fought using Indian artillery, because Indians are making a killing or making a lot of money out of selling artillery to all these countries when there's a lack. I think my point is, a defense industrial base, at least from selected, it doesn't have to be producing weapons, but components, right? So India was providing a certain component to a certain artillery. Of course, they also made the artillery shells. So Sri Lanka should explore. We have, for example, another resource, rubber, latex. Latex is a component in many military products, right? So we were providing Kevlar, the bulletproof vest. So there is, I think we should, if we are looking at economic prosperity and innovation and business, defense is an area we should explore, because that is a market that doesn't fade. Even at crisis times, defense markets, they remain, the demand remains pretty high. So my point is, when we are talking about defense reforms and restructuring, it's not just the restructuring of our armed forces or the architecture of our armed forces, but also the defense industrial base. What can we produce? Or who can invest in Sri Lanka, and we do joint ventures on defense. So what I'm trying to do is not about building weapons or anything, but components.
Okay, we can look to India, I suppose, to have expertise.
Yes. Because there is in India, there is in the recent past, there is a major push asking them to invest more in Sri Lanka. I mean, there is this, India is generating so much of FDI. India, people don't understand. India has $600 billion in reserves, right? So it's one of the most stable economies, and it's attracting a lot of FDI. A lot of international companies have come into India, and India's growth is also propelled by the southern states of India.
But do you think there is some resistance from the Sri Lankan side to engage with India, especially for this kind of investments?
I think,
and the developments we saw recently too.
Yeah. I think in Sri Lanka and India relations, there is resistance, there is suspicion, there are concerns both sides have. Sri Lanka also has, because India is driven by their interests, not values. That is what made India stronger today. They are driven by interests. So we also have to be driven by interests. So sometimes their interests may not align, but we also can seek more common ground, because bigger powers sometimes tend to think there should be a chance given to smaller powers, smaller states. So there is a certain way that we can navigate that. But my point remains, I think for Sri Lanka, India's boom is a great opportunity. Of course, challenges are there. that does, we should not think that is all going to be great. India is going to be our benevolent. No, India will pursue their interests. But I think in that pursuit, if we are strategic enough, that is why we need strategic thought. There we can exploit this.
We were talking about modern day threats, cybersecurity. I think if we can focus on that, I'm looking at frameworks, national cybersecurity strategies of China, Russia, United Kingdom, European Union. Everyone talks about cybersecurity. But how much should Sri Lanka prioritize, or how much have we so far? Do you think Sri Lanka has a framework in place strong enough to protect the country from any cybersecurity threat?
In theory, we have to understand one of the fundamental challenges Sri Lanka faces in implementing, applying overall security architectures is the lack of a national security strategy. So in most countries, these are done they are all connected to the larger national security plan. So where does cybersecurity, what does cybersecurity applications, what type of applications that we need, what are the objectives it's going to achieve? So is it going to protect national critical infrastructure? Is it going to protect, in another layer, the most important data of your citizens? And also thirdly, now the biggest problem with cybersecurity is not the technical part, but the disinformation part. So that is called how far is a society can be, how far cybersecurity can be, enforced to prevent political warfare. This is called political warfare. How can you influence publics and their decisions? So one of the biggest fallout is cybersecurity, which started as traditionally as a systems and network security approach, has come now into policy approach, where you look at data protection. Now Sri Lanka has passed a Data Protection Act, but the enaction of that is taking a long time. That is basically protection citizens' data. It's a very good thing, but we need that. But then do we have critical infrastructure that is very much driven by our critical infrastructure is not as modern as it is. So in a way, we are a little bit safe as well in that context. But it's mostly how politically vulnerable are we to aspects such as disinformation and what we call influence operations. For example, how can a third party influence decision making of our citizens through disinformation? How can we counter weaponized narratives? This is called a weaponized narrative. It's very easy to weaponize narratives. Sri Lanka is, our people are, we are victims of weaponized narratives. I don't have to remind you how we had weaponization against race, we had weaponized ethnicities, we had weaponizations given, against individuals, establishments. So if you're looking at what's happening in Sri Lanka these days, if you look at the larger strategic picture, how suddenly Sri Lanka has come back in war crimes issues, Al Jazeera, everything. If you look at it from a strategic thing, I think we are facing a major weaponized narrative influence, environment.
And finally, we haven't spoken about energy security. We've seen Sri Lanka face a lot of challenges, especially at the height of the economic crisis too. How do we really look at securing partnerships while also not putting Sri Lanka's resources, energy security at risk when we enter these partnerships?
I think you asked one of the best questions from the last. It's when you talk about energy security, maybe 10 years back, it was about the safeguarding of access, supplies, all these things. But energy security is now one of the most geopolitically weaponized areas of focus. So there are two debates. One is because we are now in a stage of what we call energy transition debate, right? So there is something called geopolitics of energy transition. Then the second thing is, if energy is being transitioned, what does energy transition means? So there is this big debate about renewable energy, the need to push towards ability to generate energy through non-fossilized means, and then how do you get that? So that is, in the context of energy transition, how do you go from coal power or fossil fuel energy powering the society, the world, into a non-fossil fuel. So that is the answer was energy transition. So that is basically electrical energy sourced from maybe different sources of wind. Maybe wind can be wind power and all these things. But the biggest debate in the energy transition is how do you store energy, and how do you process that into our mundane needs. So there comes the electric vehicle. So now if you look at the world, the biggest geopolitical hot potato today is not weapons or anything, but it's electrical vehicles. So there's a big EV battle between China and the United States and the West. Today the EU Commission is putting extra taxes on vehicles that are being imported from China, saying that the Chinese government is subsidizing those vehicles so that they are undercutting things. But the point is, nearly 70 to 80% of energy transition technology batteries are made in China. 90% of solar panels are made in China. How China has managed to come on top of that? On the other side of that is, what do you need to store? So the electronification, digitization leads to more components, which needs minerals. So there comes the critical mineral geopolitical debate. So for example, they say countries need about 200 times the minerals we used before us to sustain this. For example, data centers need copper. Copper is one of the most weaponized supply chains in the world now. That is why China is investing in Peru. Peru has the largest copper mine in Central and South America. Suddenly, what you are seeing is a newly redefined geopolitical competition. And for countries like Sri Lanka, which we are looking at supply chains access, how do we understand this? How do we manage this? So how do we manage our mineral resources? Because our mineral resources will be sought after.
Limited resources.
Yet they will be critical. And also the transit and transfer of minerals. They will be focus of the coming geopolitical battles.
Do we have any? Do you think we've had any focus on protecting our minerals or using it?
I think it's coming, but so this narrative or this labeling it as a critical mineral, bringing it into so this is the problem with the lack of a national security strategy. If you have a national security strategy, you easily can bring these things, supplies, into the national security framing and objective. So you can elevate that. That's how the Americans did. Americans have brought a couple of acts elevating certain minerals into critical minerals under the national security. Same with India, same with China. So that is not good for the rest of the world, because they are going to create a very weaponized supply chain. And that's going to be very hard for other countries.
But to
protect their own interests. But we will be squeezed from two sides. One with the supply chains. The second is with our own policies towards whatever we have as resources.
Again, to protect your a nation's national security, interests of resources, energy, economic affairs are very important, as you've outlined.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time here at Hyde Park. It was indeed an informative conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Indeewari.
We were in conversation with Dr. Harinda Vidanage, Director, Centre for Strategic Assessment and Senior Lecturer at the Strategic Studies of Sir John Kothawala Defence University, an academic, researcher and an expert in foreign policy, strategic studies and international security. We'll see you again next week with yet another discussion here at Hyde Park. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.